Hello, everybody, and welcome to this IfG webinar looking at what civil servants should, and perhaps even more importantly, shouldn't do during the campaign as polling day approaches. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. Formal restrictions on government and civil service activity started on the 25th of May and will continue right up to and including polling day itself. The election campaign is an unusual time for civil servants. Frankly, I used to always go on holiday during them, but anyway. So today we'll explore how those who are still hanging around in the country will work during the election campaign, how that changes, and what they need to prepare for a possible change in government or a return of the ministers and they've been working with so far. To do this, I'm joined by an excellent panel with vast amounts of experience on all of this. Sir David Bell is now Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sunderland, but was the permanent secretary at the Education Department from 2006 to 2012. The wise among you will have spotted that meant he was in post in 2010. Catherine Haddon is a programme director for the IfG Academy that is training people all over government in how to prepare for transitions, but she's also the author of a lot of IfG work on that. And Alex Thomas is also a programme director for the IfG Civil Service Programme, is a former senior civil servant, but is also a more junior civil servant, I think, at the time of the 2010 transition. And I myself have lived through a couple of transitions, one totally unmemorable and one extremely memorable. More of that later, perhaps. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start by asking the panelists a few questions, but you can also put in your questions through Slido, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. Because so many people have signed up for this event, we'd only schedule it to 12:45, but if there's enough interest, so it depends on you, we'll run it through to 1. So make sure you've checked the timer on your cooking or whatever you're doing while you're multitasking at home. If you'd like questions someone else has asked, then it's much more helpful for us, even though they haven't put it quite as well as you would have done if you upvote it, so we can get to those questions that people are really, really interested in. So without further ado, let's get going. Kath, what are the rules restricting government activity during this pre-election period of sensitivity, formerly known as PERDA? And what does that actually mean in practice for civil servants?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say for anyone not a civil servant is that government remains in place. It is able to act. In particular, it is able to act during a crisis. But there are restrictions, so there is a lot of downtime during this period. There's not supposed to be initiating any major new policy, major new appointments or public contracts or anything. Basically, essential business is all that is supposed to continue during that period. So ministers remain ministers. They will be taking any urgent decisions, but by and large, they'll probably be absent from departments when they're out on the campaign trail, unless they are stepping down or they are a member of the House of Lords. So it is a quieter time, certainly. Obviously, that allows a lot of the civil service to do preparation for the election result, which we'll get to. But there's obviously also restrictions around what civil servants can do in that time. The main thing to remember is the impartiality of the civil service is what is paramount during that period. So there are restrictions on what they can do in terms of political activity, but particularly in terms of ministers, government resources should not be used for anything to do with the election campaigns. They can't get a government car to a campaign event. They can't use any government people or resources for electoral speeches. So there's got to be a separation, and they also can't use government communication. So government Twitter accounts are much quieter, and there isn't any kind of announcement of policies that might impinge upon the election.
So Alex, actually just picking up that point from Kath, there are these restrictions, but we've seen maybe this government perhaps slightly less willing to stick to the rules about what might happen. We've seen some slightly dubious use of government official accounts. How actually are those restrictions enforced during a campaign? Who does that fall to?
Well, ultimately, it's the cabinet secretary and sort of the top of the civil service and the propriety and ethics team in the cabinet office. But I would start a little bit differently in terms of the enforcement, because one of the main messages that I would try to leave, particularly those civil servants watching today, is that it's about individual people's judgment. A lot of, and I suspect we're going to return to this in terms of the pre-election restrictions again and again and again. Don't come at this thinking there is a bright line rule and a set of guidance that is going to tell me exactly how I should behave in this situation. It's about you, it's about your individual judgment. So the first enforcement mechanism, if you like, is civil servants applying their own judgment and exercising discretion in the ways that Kath said, and holding fast to particularly the civil service value of impartiality. So I can't say that often enough, really. The guidance can't cover every possible scenario. It is on you to apply your judgment. But of course, there is then an escalation route. It would be very unfair to ask individual civil servants to be making potentially quite contentious and controversial judgments on, whether a tweet can go out or whether an event can happen or whether a particular announcement can be made. So there's the usual, go up your line, talk to your line manager, and they will help you make a judgment. That then goes up to the permanent secretary of an individual department, and most kind of uh, ordinary questions during an election campaign would be resolved by the permanent secretary and their office looking at the guidance and then advising on what can happen. If they're unsure, that's when they go to the cabinet office, the propriety and ethics team. If they're unsure or it's particularly contentious, that's when it goes to the cabinet secretary. So it goes all the way up the tree. And obviously, during a campaign, these things happen more quickly than they might normally. So you can expect controversial things to be escalated very, very quickly. Enforcement, as I said, yes, it's ultimately the cabinet secretary, but like so many things in the British Constitution, if a minister really, and ultimately the Prime Minister really wants to do something, then there's not a lot that the civil service can do to stop it other than point to the guidance.
Alex, just to add in a quick question from Anonymous, and frankly, Anonymous is doing a lot of work on the Q&A. Could I just say
That's fair
hello,
enough on this
Anonymous?
subject.
Which I think is absolutely fair enough. Something that's been affecting us actually at IfG. Anonymous has just said we've seen certain learning events and presentations of civil service postponed due to the election period, which don't seem related to general election content. And we've seen civil servants withdrawing from sort of private round tables, which we might normally expect them to attend. But practice seems to differ between departments. What are the sort of rules on that? Or is that just another judgment thing?
I think it is partly because different people make different judgments and circumstances, and the civil service has a natural inclination to be risk averse in these situations. I think in general, during an election campaign, a bit of risk aversion on the part of the civil service is not a bad thing. That said, I would make a distinction, and I think the rules, if you look at them carefully, make a distinction between public events or public activity and private activity. I think it is completely reasonable for the civil service to continue, in fact, essential in some cases, for the civil service to continue with private activity, discussions with particular groups, maybe preparing for what the outcome of the election might look like, and to continue that work as long as it is not a public intervention in the campaign or a private event that is so sensitive that it might be leaked or cause problems in other circumstances. My advice would be that the majority of public facing things should be postponed or cancelled. The majority of private facing things, particularly if they are about the capability of the civil service, should go ahead.
And is every civil servant politically restricted? Is every civil servant, if I'm an executive officer in a benefits office, am I allowed to go and deliver leaflets to my local candidate?
Yes, there's quite. I mean, David and Kath should come in on this. I don't want to dominate, but there's quite specific guidance about the politically restricted categories, which is sort of grade 7 and file streamer and above are sort of in the most restricted category, and then there's other guidance. I won't run through it all here, not least because I haven't sorted up on it in advance of this, which I should have done. But depending on the sensitivity of your job and your grade, there are different activities that you can do. We do, of course, get every election civil servants wanting to stand for election, so they have to resign from the civil service and then can be re-employed afterwards if they don't get elected. But there is detailed guidance. You should be able to find it quite easily online about what you can and can't do. And then the same principle applies. If in doubt, take it up the chain.
Okay, David, might come back to that, but David, I mean, you were running a government department at a time of a change. So once the election was called, not a surprise in 2010, we sort of roughly knew when the election was going to be. How did your work change on, the day that the election was called?
Well, one of the advantages immediately, Jill, was that you could have a wider discussion within the civil service team about what the different parties were proposing. Up until then, although the pre-election talks had been taking place, the permanent secretaries would have been cautious, I would imagine, about what they shared more widely, and that was entirely proper. So essentially what we did is we just set in train a whole set of different work streams. So for example, we agreed that we would try to put together a one side of A4 briefing on all the key policy areas within the department. So it was good discipline right away for civil servants having to write one side of A4. But we thought that that was a good early introduction to the ministerial team, whatever the outcome of the election. So that work began. We then had a related but slightly separate work stream on the key issues that we thought would be most important for ministers to deal with, the so-called day one issues. What would you be asking your Secretary of State or ministers to adjudicate on very rapidly? Those were maybe slightly longer briefings, but again, we felt brevity was key. And then as the weeks progressed, we went through a kind of set of interrogations of civil servants as we tested out how they would respond to the lines of questions that might come from a new ministerial team. And ultimately, I remember holding the pen on the briefing documents because I wanted to make sure that I understood them and we were really clear and sharp so there would be no ambiguity. I think one last thing to say on that, Jill, I always remind the civil servants that one of the oddities of our system is that ministers will arrive in the department, provided it's a clear-cut election result, absolutely knackered. We do not have a transition like other systems. And actually, we have to be very sensitive to the fact that the winning side will probably be even more knackered because they've been out celebrating the night before. So there's just something about the human dimension of preparing for a change of government that actually we have to bear in mind, because civil servants will probably have been working to a different kind of pace during this time.
So, David, I'm just intrigued. I mean, obviously 2010 was quite weird in the sense of the government not changing hands at lunchtime on the Friday. But had you lined up people to come in all over the weekend? Should civil servants be giving back their Wimbledon tickets, she says bitterly, as somebody with tickets for the 5th of July, which I chose, stupid person. Should they be telling their families, we'll see you in a week and a half's time? How did you organise that first weekend? And do you sort of schedule that? Or are you basically going to give advice saying, frankly, Minister, you might be really enthusiastic and ready to go, but you're knackered, just go and have a rest and we'll see you on Monday?
No, I certainly didn't say that, Jill. We had lined up quite a lot of senior officials to be ready and available on Friday. And I remember saying to people, we're likely to be here all weekend and we're probably likely to be here for most of the day for the following few days afterwards. So it turned out to be very odd. And I remember having to say to people on the Friday morning, I just stand down. There is no point in us all hanging around here. And particularly, as I recall, sort of 24 hours in from 2010, it was clear that time would elapse before a government would be formed. And I remember on the Saturday afternoon being at home, cutting my grass and thinking, I never thought I would be doing this on the Saturday after an election. So I'd imagine, Jill, that every permanent secretary will have a team of people lined up. Don't forget, this is the moment where first impressions count. And it's human nature to make a quick judgment about the people that you meet if you're a new minister. So I think all permanent secretaries and senior colleagues across the civil service will be thinking, how do they create that strong, positive impression with whichever Secretary of State and whichever ministers cross the threshold on the 5th of July.
And David, our top voted question from inevitably Anonymous, I just wanted to put to you, which is a question, if I come in, I'm a new Secretary of State, I'm from a different government, can I say, I never understood why my predecessor made this decision. Can I have a look at the advice that the department put to them? Can you show an incoming minister the advice that was put to previous ministers?
The rule that we applied, and don't forget, Jill, I've been away from this for 14 years, and there are other experts on this webinar, was that no, you couldn't see the submissions that had been given to previous ministers. You could, of course, in a submission to a new ministerial team, say something about the thought process or the rationale that a previous Secretary of State or Minister had undertaken, as it were, as part of the process. But I think civil service rightly, not just for constitutional reasons, but also for political reasons, did not want to give any new ministerial team, as it were, ammunition to attack their predecessors through using civil service documentation. I always thought that was a very wise and sensible approach. And the other thing, maybe it's related to this, I remember a number of civil servants saying to me, well, what's the policy going to be after the election? And my line was, well, the policy is as it is unless and until a ministerial decision is made to change the policy. And for many colleagues in the first few days, it was sort of steady as she goes, because ministers had not yet turned to the business that might face them eventually. So that's why all these briefing papers were very important. So a minister could have a quick glance at what the existing policy was and then could make a judgment about how quickly they might turn their attention to it.
And David, how would you advise the department in terms of how much time to devote to the manifestos of different parties? Had you actually done a big thorough brief on what the Lib Dems were looking for in education, what maybe the SNP was looking for? Obviously, education's odd because it's devolved, probably not so relevant. But had you been thinking through some of those hung parliament scenarios and what areas of policy might come into play? And I don't know whether that was any different from other times when people thought it was pretty clear it was going to be one of the two major parties.
I think we assumed rightly that it would take a good few days for the manifestos to appear, and we weren't all going to sit around waiting for the manifestos. I think we all knew, and this will be the case now, that each of the political parties had been saying things already through ministerial or shadow ministerial or opposition speeches. There might have been publications out there. There might have been think tanks that were close to each of the political parties that had been influencing thinking. So there was a rich source base ahead of the manifestos. As I recall, in 2010, the manifestos were relatively thin in content when it came to education. And I suspect manifestos, even more so now, are going to be relatively thin documents. So I wouldn't hang around waiting to see what the manifesto says, because you might be disappointed. There might not be a lot there. And as it turned out in 2010, there was quite a bit that overlapped, because everyone was in favour, for example, of a pupil premium. So there was quite a bit of overlap there. As for hung parliaments, short answer was within the department we hadn't, but as permanent secretaries in the run-up to the election, we had been thinking about different kinds of scenarios. Or to be honest, I don't think I predicted how it ended up.
So, Kath, David's given us a very sort of, view from the top, but how does transition affect civil servants working at different levels? If I'm working on quite an obscure issue that's maybe not a priority commitment, do I just let this all pass me by, or quite how does that pan out?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, ultimately, in every department, the permanent secretary decides how to run it. They set up the team who are doing that central work. They are often the one who is holding the pen on those first day briefings. But, all of the policy teams, the policy leads will be having to think about and provide advice into that process on how does it affect them. David is quite right that by and large, policies just continue unless and until a new government changes them. The thing that when we do talks around the civil service, speaking to people, particularly about how a change of government is different from a returned government or from a reshuffle or a change of prime minister, as we have done a few of recently. With a change of government, you've got to be conscious that there may be kind of changes to language, to the landscape of stakeholders and people that are interested and so forth, that can become really important. And David's point about first impressions is crucial there. So yes, the policy continues, but you've got to be ready for when the minister finds out about the policy and they're like, well, we don't want to do that. Or if you go in and your advice is, well, we've been doing it this way, I recommend you continue, blah, 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 is trying to be conscious and get as much intel as possible about how you are positioning that policy and will it affect. We certainly saw in 2010 examples of ministers sort of, getting advice that felt like the advice that would have been given to Labour, and it felt like it clashed for them. And that's the really tricky thing to do. And again, this is something for the senior people in the department to really lead on, but it is certainly something that it is good for all civil servants who are working on policy to be aware of, that, there may be nuances to how you are presenting new policy or policy options or whatever that will be very different for a new government. And it's just also to just be resilient to all the change that could come. It's not just that the policy might change. You might have to move people around, new units, change the sort of structure of policy teams, bring in extra support. Obviously, if there's machinery of government changes, which we always recommend against if you want to make progress in policy. But if there are important ones, being conscious that that's going to have an impact on you. And also, just as David said, being aware of the rules and so forth. Yes, papers of a previous administration, it's for decades, that was something that was shelved. You don't pass that on. So you have to make sure that you get new advice. We've heard stories of, a new minister going off to do a scheduled speech that was in the calendar for the previous administration and be given the speech that was obviously for their predecessor. And the civil servant saying, well, the policy hasn't changed, I haven't changed the speech. But, it's little things like that that can, especially for if it is a new minister and they're inexperienced, they won't understand why you've done that. So really thinking through, okay, but do I need to change how I approach things, given, if there are a new bunch of people at the top of government, given how things could change?
David, I'm very intrigued as to what you did in DFE to, help officials think through looking at policies, maybe policies, as Kath was saying, that are continuing. This goes for another question from Anonymous again. Policies that were continuing, but talking to a different regime about them, or being aware of things that might be sensitive to a new government that weren't sensitive to the last one. Did you do a lot of internal training with your civil servants on how to be alert, or with private offices
Yes.
as the key front line?
Yes, we did, Jill, although we didn't get it absolutely right, and I'll come to that in a minute. I think in this country now we've become used to long periods of single party in control, never mind the number of prime ministers that have passed in and out. And therefore, I think that makes it harder for the civil service, because almost without being political with a capital P, you start to intuit how a particular party will talk, how they'll think, what they'll do, and so on. And therefore, part of this is less about the policy as it is about the culture and the outlook and the attitudes, to pick up what Kath said. Let me give you a very specific example. It was made very clear to us that the D word, the delivery word, would not be used in the presence of an incoming Conservative government. So we spent a lot of time as civil servants would thinking about which other word could be used then. And I think we fetched on implementation rather than delivery. But it was both a trivial and quite a serious point, because if you'd gone in and said, well, what are your delivery chains going to be, Minister, you would have immediately generated an allergic reaction. There was just no doubt about that. So there are very simple things like that matter. Now, I said we didn't get it absolutely right. And I think one of the things that, if I reflect on all of this, that I underestimated was the extent to which we didn't quite get ourselves into the philosophical mindset that had shifted. So by the time 2010 came, we'd been at the high water mark of government intervention or activity. It was an activist government in education. It was very clear under Michael Gove we were going to have a different kind of activism. And actually, we were going to have a withdrawal of activism or from activism in quite a lot of policy areas. I actually think we misjudged the extent to which civil servants would just get that. And civil servants on one or two occasions were just bewildered when a minister or the Secretary of State would say, well, we're not interested in that. And we're just literally not interested in that. And what's the government doing in that business anyway? So I think there is something about trying to understand how is the government going to think about ideology and philosophy without being political, because I think that's where some of those missteps happen, when you just don't quite get the judgment right about how you say something or what you're assuming a minister will think when they're making a decision.
And can I just come in on that quickly, because I just think, just to emphasize David's point, this is a really important moment for the civil service. It might only happen once every 15 years in terms of the cycles that we've seen, if we do get a change of government. And this is the civil service's moment to prove and reprove its value to ministers. The civil service doesn't have some fount of legitimacy that exists, mystically in the crown or somewhere. It has to prove it has to demonstrate its legitimacy comes from its effectiveness and comes from its usefulness. So it needs to be able to, and it's not easy, but it's quite fun and interesting to be able to think itself into that sort of philosophical space in exactly the way that David described it. One of the concerns that I've heard expressed, and I think this will be difficult for the civil service to get the balance right on this, is the kind of reactive, proactive balance that at the start of a government the civil service is going to have to make. So you do need to look at the manifestos, and you need to listen really carefully to what incoming ministers are saying that they want to achieve, and then respond to that. But I also suspect there will be an expectation, particularly if it is a Labour government and a more activist Labour government, that they want policy ideas and an interpretation of their policy from the civil service as well. So I think there's something about proving your value in all of this. One, just as I'm talking, but one point I was going to make related to something that Cass said, it's a really obvious point, but I think it's important to say in this context, which is we get obsessed by policy civil servants and a relatively small cadre of officials working in the centre of government with ministers on policy. Clearly, the vast majority of civil servants are working on operational delivery, and as Kath said right at the start, government must continue, and the provision of public services must continue. And so while I think it pays all civil servants to have an eye to what's going on in government, but we are talking about a relatively small group of people here.
Alex, that's a brilliant segue, because I was just going to take a quick time out from the transition to the continuing government as normal. Obviously, we're spending time trying to get to grips with changes of philosophy, reading manifestos, things, but the business of government has to continue. Alex, what happens if something big happens during an election campaign? We saw some of that in 2017 with terrorist attacks. If we'd gone the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, we might have had COVID in the middle of 2020 campaign. What happens then to government? How does that work? Can government react, or is it very hamstrung?
So government continues. Ministers are still ministers, as I think Kath said, and it is really important to emphasise that ministers can still act. All of this restraint is important for the impartiality of the civil service, but ultimately the security of the country and responding to crises or emergencies. So, we in 2017, I was Jeremy Hayward's PPS. We saw that awful succession of terrorist attacks during the campaign. Government had to respond to that. Ministers had to respond to that, and they did. So that all continues. Of course, that affects the tenor and tone of the campaign, and therefore, the context is important, and so it does change the context, and that might change what the government does. But essentially, the operation of government continues. I think it's worth, I mean, let's not go too far down this sort of dark alley, but it is worth saying that in extremis, there is also the ability for ministers to govern even when quite COVID or even more significant things happen. We're in a very odd constitutional period at the moment because the House of Commons doesn't exist anymore. MPs don't exist, and so it could be hard for government to legislate in an emergency if it needed to. We do have, though, the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, which gives ministers in extremis very wide powers to legislate and to overrule primary legislation in response to an emergency. And so even if you needed to do something that required all sorts of radical legislation to get through, if we went there, the Civil Contingencies Act could kick in, and that would even include potentially changing the date of the general election. I mean, one of the acts that was not excluded from that was the legislation around the ending of a parliament. So I say, let's not go too far down that road, but it is really important to emphasise that ministers can still act, and if necessary, respond in an emergency.
And would you expect them to be consulting the leader of the opposition and their shadows in those circumstances, or would that be a luxury that they could discard if they wanted to?
Yes, you would. I think I'd say if it was something so extraordinary, you'd expect them to consult the leader of the opposition regardless, as to some extent happened during the pandemic, although it then fragmented. So yes, I think it would be good practice to do that if we were faced in such a national emergency anyway, but certainly during an election campaign, and certainly anything to do with around the rules of the election, you would want to do on a cross-party basis.
Yeah, just to jump in, we've got an explainer coming out on this, hopefully later today as well. And yes, there is an expectation that they will consult the opposition. It's worth saying that if there is an unclear election result among Parliament, that period continues in whilst the government is uncertain. And we saw this in 2010, where there were negotiations going on to bail out the Greek government because of its deficit crisis. And the weekend that the negotiations were happening, the then Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling had to go and vote on the bailout that they were providing. And it's supposed to be that you consult the opposition, I think. So Alistair Darling has said that he consulted George Osborne and the Lib Dems, but I think George Osborne said that it was more like he was informed, and that he didn't really feel like he was able to react back to it. So whether you call it consult or inform, but there's certainly a convention and expectation that they will be kept in the loop on anything like that.
And just one more on a sort of similar-ish theme, a question we had in from Anne Watt from Pivotal in Northern Ireland. What about government in the devolves? I mean, we have UK civil servants working for the Scottish and Welsh governments. They're not being elected, getting on with governing. We have Northern Ireland Civil Service, a separate civil service working for the newly restored devolved government. I think Anne said Northern Ireland passed a budget earlier this week, but ministers there have said it would be inappropriate to publish a programme for government during the UK election campaign. So what can and can't be done by the devolves? Who wants to take that up?
I will happily take it. Yeah. It's an excellent question, and it's a really interesting one. So the election guidance doesn't affect the devolved administrations in the same way, because they're obviously elected separately to the House of Commons. They are continuing as governments doing what they do. What is worth saying, though, and it is really interesting the way in which this is written up in the guidance that was published last week, is that the devolved administrations largely continue as normal, but it says they are aware of the need to avoid any action that is or could be construed as being party political or have an effect on the general election. So they are supposed to some extent, follow some of the similar guidance about making sure that communication, announcements and so forth aren't interfering with the election campaign or could be construed as being party political. Now, the fact that they use that, the devolved administrations are aware and sort of slightly removed language, it just shows that it isn't something that is enforced. So it is really up to their discretion on how they operate. It isn't something that the UK government can enforce as much as it can enforce on their own civil servants. So it really is a bit of a grey area that is largely down to the devolves in terms of how they respond to it. But certainly to some extent that guidance and that restricted period does apply, but not in the same way as it does to the UK government.
And it's worth saying the Scottish government, for example, has put out its own guidance around these elections, even though it's not a Scottish parliamentary election. So they do kind of respond to that point that Kath said there. I think it does come down to the judgment point again, and you would expect those civil servants and ministers in the devolved administrations to apply that judgment. And I think you could say, passing a finance bill is essential for the business of government. A Northern Ireland programme for government, you might touch on all sorts of cross-border issues or questions that go to the go to other administrations across the country. So you can construct a rationale around that, and it may be a convenient rationale or not for ministers at the time, but in the end it comes back to the judgment of everyone involved.
Yeah, just a quick PSA on that, because it has been a problem previously. Obviously, we are talking about all the restrictions that are in place, but it is worth remembering that they don't restrict everything. In 2017, there was confusion because research bodies who have funding from public money, so funding from the government, there was confusion about whether academics could put out research that had been publicly funded through those research councils. They can. And the guidance was never supposed to stop things like that. And similarly, we had a bit of confusion another previous election where routine statistics, it was, I can't remember which ones it was, but they were should they be on hold or not? Again, the guidance is very clear. Routine statistics, it would be political to withhold them during this period, so they should be published. So it doesn't restrict everything. So as we said at the top, if you really aren't certain, go through that chain of command and find out, because some things shouldn't be stopped during this period.
And David will know this from the University of Sunderland, but Stian Westlake, who chair of the ESRC, has put out a very good tweet thread reassuring academics that actually they should be contributing to their research to the election debate rather than holding back. David, I want to come back. That was a brief furrow back into business as usual, but let's go back into transitions. David, I've got a question here. What advice would you give to a private office about how to deal with a minister or a special advisor set who have never been in government before?
Well, Jill, that's going to be the majority if it's a change of government, because almost inevitably after 14 years, there are relatively few people who will have any experience of government if they've been in opposition for that period of time. We've not touched on special advisors so far in this conversation, but they are, of course, a very important part of the process, and we may come back to that, Jill. Just in terms of a ministerial office, I mean, again, it's that bit about just put yourself in the shoes of a incoming minister. Not just will they be knackered, as I mentioned earlier, they'll be very nervous. Unless they are supremely confident individuals, they will be nervous. They'll just had a message from the Prime Minister saying you're about to become a minister of the country, and they'll want to know what this is going to mean. So there's some basic housekeeping that is very important for a private office to put together, almost a little crib sheet of how the private office works, what it means to be a minister, what sorts of things that you will be doing, how will you allocate your time, how will you spend time in Parliament as opposed to in the department, just really basic things. And of course, for private offices, they'll have been so used to doing this with a succession of ministers that they'll just have taken so many things for granted. So there's almost like go back to basics and really just start and think about how you would explain your job and how your office works to a complete outsider, because in the vast majority of cases, that's what they're going to get, a complete outsider.
And David, I mean, do ministers come in and say, well, this office worked for my predecessor. I want different people.
That's, in my experience, that was relatively unusual. It's perhaps more of an issue at Secretary of State level than it is in more junior ministerial posts, because again, you have to be supremely confident as a junior minister to come in and start, as it were, throwing your weight around about who the private office is. But I think most ministers, in my experience, valued the institutional knowledge and the departmental knowledge of the civil servants in the private office. So usually it was less about, can I get rid of person X or Y? It was more about, can I supplement my office with person X or Y? Now that, of course, is not a straightforward issue to deal with, but most of the time ministers want the experience. And again, back to what we were saying about first impressions, civil servants, make yourself invaluable.
Yeah,
to
Jill, if I could
minister.
come in as well, because the IfG Academy has got lots of materials, not only for new ministers and special advisors, but also for private office if you are preparing for a potential new minister. And I mean, what David said there, I cannot emphasize that enough. Remember that these are human beings, and that if they haven't been in government before, a lot of it is quite bizarre to you. You've not heard about a submission or a write around, you don't know how it operates. You're being sent to all these meetings from the get-go, and you don't know, what am I supposed to do in it? You've never had to take the level and the number of decisions that you're suddenly being asked to do it. So I would say it's not even just explain private office, what it does and how it works, but be aware that it's quite valuable to just explain why that you're going into this meeting, what's expected of you, and what the decisions are to be made and so forth. And if there is one plea I could make to the civil service about how they prepare for a potential change of government, it is that remember that these are human beings, and that if they don't, if they haven't been through it before, it is a big transition for them, and give them a little bit of space and time, and possibly even bring in the IfG, because we do have programs of support to help people in those circumstances.
And Kath, I'm going to ask you another, which might even look like a planted question from one of your team. Will incoming MPs and ministers get training in how the civil service works, what they do and what they don't do? So will they be aware of how the civil service functions?
Yes, they do, and they will. Certainly the IfG is preparing for induction sessions for new ministers. We've done those at previous elections. We also obviously do a preparation for government programme with the opposition, which we have done. I can't go into the details in terms of confidentiality, but we do cover various of those aspects. So hopefully they're a bit familiar with all of this stuff. But yes, the IfG will be putting out a new programme and an offer to new or returned ministers or new ministers of a returned government. And we also know, though, that the Cabinet Office do think through all of this. I think it doesn't get emphasised enough is my big problem. It's something that the permanent secretaries really need to think about how they can support, because it is a big struggle. And a lot of ministers, we've interviewed, more than 150 previous ones, and it is the one thing that they say time and again is in those first few days and weeks, just having that opportunity to reflect on what is it that they're trying to achieve and why, and less being sort of just thrown around the place from sort of meeting to meeting without feeling like you've got a grip on it yourself. That is really important for them. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, David, you've been emphasising how knackered people will be. So we've got a question here. Should civil servants be prepared for new ministers to appear and then disappear almost immediately? I've added the almost immediately on summer recess. Or should they be prepared for ministers who basically have, maybe in the case of a change of government, been waiting best decade plus to get into government? Will they want to work flat out through the summer? Would you be advising your colleagues to be cancelling their summer leave plans?
Well, this is a really interesting question because of the timing of the election. I mean, in May 2010, you had about 6 or 7 weeks, perhaps slightly more than that, actually slightly more than that, until recess at the end of July, middle of the end of July. Here, we're talking about quite a short time, although I think I've seen some talk that the holiday might be shortened as a new government, if it comes in, wants to get on with business. My experience, and it was only the one occasion, Jill, was that ministers were quite relieved to get to the recess. They wanted, obviously, to carry on with government, and certainly there was an energetic Secretary of State in 2010 in the Department for Education, and he wanted to keep business going. But actually, even Michael Gove took holiday during that time. And I think, this is ultimately a personal decision, but I remember advising ministers, you've got to take a breather, because if you think it's tough now, just wait till you get to the autumn. And it's going to be really tough. So I think there is good advice that we can give to just take a breather. But that's not necessarily the same as the civil service taking a breather, because it'll probably be the case, particularly if there's a change of government, there will be a huge number of things that ministers will have set in train from the 5th of July onwards. And I think the civil service will have to prepare to be pretty busy so that ministers can come back with a lot of material ready to act into the autumn.
And David, just on that, I've got a very interesting question from someone who is a self-declared policy G7. Really interested, because we heard in 2010 of civil servants in some departments really reluctant to challenge manifesto commitments that had made. And I think heard this doing some sessions with department which had quite controversial changes take place, but just felt they had to go with things that was in the manifesto. So Policy G7's just asked, what's the right balance between taking forward new ministers' ideas and challenging them where we think they might not work?
Well, you have to challenge, and you have to provide good, frank and open advice to ministers. Now, if it's clear that the elected government of the day wants to pursue a particular policy, you are duty-bound as a civil servant to prepare the necessary materials, but those necessary materials should include the potential pitfalls. I always said to civil servants, don't just say no, because that's the road to ruin with new ministers. What you have to be able to do is to put policy options. Now, if the minister decides still to go with what they want to do, and you've provided fair and frank advice, that's absolutely reasonable that they do so. But please, 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 to the civil service, do provide the frankness of advice, because actually, if you don't do it from the beginning, it's going to be much, much harder as time goes on. But you've got to handle this carefully. And one of the things that I did, Jill, in the earliest days of 2010, after the government was formed, I sat in literally every meeting that Michael Gove had, partly just because I wanted to see what the dynamics were like, and I wanted to get a sense of how Michael and the ministers were behaving, responding. But I also wanted to see how the civil servants were responding and reacting. And actually, you could be too assertive, and that didn't necessarily work too well. But if you sat there quietly, when you knew there was a piece of information or there was a perspective you should bring to the debate, that was a problem. So just trying to judge is difficult. But yes, you have to speak frankly, but you have to provide options and alternatives. That's what good civil servants in the policy functions do.
And one thing just to add to that, I think one of the things you do have to do is show that you get the objective that the minister or the government is trying to achieve. And that almost gives you license then to say, you trust that I understand what you're trying to do. And I'm coming from a good place in saying, I don't think this will work in that way. I think we should, you might consider doing it in another way. So you need to get the objective. That really doesn't mean trying to show that you're some ideological fellow traveller or anything. And in my experience, actually, ministers felt a bit uncomfortable. There's a discomfort if you're sort of trying to show that you're party political in some way. Ministers find that uncomfortable because that's not what you're there to do as a civil servant. So they don't want that, but they do want to show that you've really absorbed the thing that they're trying to achieve. And then that opens up a whole set of other conversations that you can have.
Oh, Alex, okay, 2 quick fire questions for you. When would we expect to hear about any possible machinery of government changes?
Oh, great mysteries. There'll be all sorts of rumors swirling around after even if nothing actually happens, there'll be rumors swirling around after the election, but quite quickly. So I joined the Ministry of Justice just before the 2010 election, to do constitutional and electoral policy work. So the electoral systems referendum and boundary changes and all of that kind of stuff as it turned into. So I was joining the Ministry of Justice, and within a month, we'd become the Cabinet Office because Nick Clegg, as the Deputy Prime Minister, wanted to own that policy area. So there was after the 5 days in May government negotiations to form the coalition, there was then another period of maybe 4 or 5 days, I think, where it was very unclear exactly what was going to happen. Clegg had said he wanted constitutional stuff, but we didn't know what that would mean institutionally and organisationally. And then it became clear within the week that we would be moving to the Cabinet Office. So if that happens, expect to sort of hear whispers in the wind, and then a period of uncertainty that can be quite discomforting for everybody involved, and then the kind of formal announcement to come when everybody's ready to make it. That, of course, doesn't actually mean that very much changes other than kind of your email signature, because you'll still stay in the same building in the short term. You'll have to keep the same email addresses, and then over the course of months and sometimes years, that steadily changes, which is, I think Kath said, is a huge overhead, but is something that the government machine does do.
But if there are new departments created, would we expect that on day one?
I think the announcement would come quite quickly, whether it's day one or not. But you obviously would need to appoint a Secretary of State to that department. So if it's something that requires senior ministerial kind of personnel, then that would come out straight away. Yeah.
Yeah. And a quick question to any of you who want to answer this one. Do you think many of the top of the office civil servants will change if there is a new government? This has become quite a habit in Australia that loads of permanent secretaries get fired when the government changes. But do we expect to clear out of the top ranks? Alex.
I could kick off that sensitive one. Nice easy one there. I think there's the sort of the first answer is yes. I think you would expect a bit of a turnover for the technical reason that quite a few permanent secretaries will have extended their term in office so that they can see through the election, and then a few months afterwards, 6-9 months maybe, they would move on. So you would expect a natural circulation there because of the kind of the way that permanent secretaries' jobs are organised. There may also be a bit of kind of chemistry testing, and so if a Secretary of State and a permanent secretary really don't get on, that could play out as well. I think the unhealthy thing it would be to expect that for ideological or other reasons there should be a change of leadership of a department or of the civil service kind of automatically, the kind of Tom Scholar scenario where on day one somebody is booted out because they're not considered to fit. There obviously has been speculation about the Cabinet Secretary and whether Simon Case would stay in post. I think in the end, as Cabinet Secretary, you need to have you need to operate with the confidence of the Prime Minister, and so that is a decision for Keir Starmer if he came in and Simon Case. So we will see, but I think there definitely shouldn't be an assumption of automaticity, and if personnel is to change, it should be done in an ordered way, but also in a fair way to everybody concerned.
Hey.
I'm just going to add to that, Jill, if I might. Permanent secretaries are human too. They will be thinking what the future might hold for them, because we have seen different changes, particularly after a long period of one party in power, turnover. And Alex's analysis was absolutely spot on. But there will be a degree of suspicion. And I think going back to something that you said when asking about the purdah period or the activities in the run-up to this, Jill, there will be some suspicion that the civil service at the top end has been compromised by the behaviours of ministers, which civil service it is perceived to be the case that some senior civil servants have allowed to pass. And I think that's the risk at the moment. I don't think Labour, if it was Labour, would come in and want a complete clear out. But then there's all the other factors that Alex talked about. But I'm sure permanent secretaries are just thinking quite carefully about this. And hopefully, although the pre-election talks were inevitably curtailed because of the calling of the election, hopefully permanent secretaries and shadow secretaries, if it is a change of government, will have begun to establish a rapport that will serve everyone well should there be a change of government.
Now we're coming to the end of even our extended time, and millions of questions are coming in. So thanks everybody very much. We'll have to think about whether we can answer them online or do another follow-up event, because there's so many brilliant questions coming in. Clearly a lot of demand for this. But I just wanted to go with the sort of top voted question. I'm going to slightly redo it. So Anonymous has asked what mistakes do central strategy unit teams tend to make when planning for a new government? That's quite interesting inwardness there, but I want to broaden that a bit to just for your final reflections, maybe what mistakes have previous civil servants made in planning for a new government, and what have they done really right? So what should we learn from the way in which they've prepared for elections before that we should be looking to replicate? Kath, you are historian of transitions, long gone. What works well? What are some of the mistakes that we should learn from and not replicate?
Yeah, I wanted to go first because then, David's got a bit of forewarning. So we've covered one of them, which is, remember that these people are human. And the same goes in the reverse, that, I would hope that if there are a bunch of new ministers, special advisors, they remember that the civil service are humans, that, again, exhaustion, personality clashes, mistakes, these are all things that over time you can get through. Yes, first impressions matter, but also remember that actually over time things can be resolved. But the other thing I would say for departments and for strategy units to think about is that get your facts right. And David knows where I'm going here, but building schools for the future, I mean, it was a classic example. We use it all the time of the department not getting a piece of factual information right and embarrassing the new minister and that kind of stuff. Things like that are going to happen. They always happen. No transition period is entirely smooth. But as far as possible, if you can get your numbers right, get your information, your briefing in, especially when it's about new ministers going in front of the telly or in front of Parliament, try and get those as right as possible. And the other thing is, remember that this is a transition and it takes time. It isn't about just that first weekend. It is about the weeks and months afterwards. And it is also about the inheritance that they're getting. One thing we haven't really talked about here, but is the stuff that they're inheriting includes all the risks. So if you are in, operational roles or frontline delivery or whatever, be aware that new ministers also need to know about those risks that are out there. What is the thing that's going to send their plans for government sideways because they did not anticipate it coming, and make sure that those get escalated as well as all of the policy advice.
Shall I chip in just to give David the last word then? So I'll very quickly. My mistake, the mistakes that I've seen happen is a classic civil service thing of the fetishization of process over content. And I think, that came to mind because of the reference to strategy units. But I think you need a degree of process, you need a few Excel spreadsheets, but actually it's the content of the work and the thinking that matters. And then the things that do well as all the other stuff that we talked about understanding objectives and everything, is do sweat the small stuff, the opposite of the advice you'd normally give. And I think that goes to the point that we've all made about ministers being human. I was struck by all the reports of the coalition negotiations. David Laws's book gave as much space to the sandwiches, the quality of the sandwiches in the cabinet office, as it gave to huge discussions about policy that would set the direction of the country for the next 5 years. So in that period, sweat the small stuff and really think through how everything is going to come across.
And David, final word.
Well, Jill, I thought I was going to get through this hour without building schools for the future being mentioned. It's going to be on my tombstone. I'll come back to that in a moment. What we got right, I think, was we understood what the key priority was, which was to get legislation into the House of Commons and through before the recess on academies. And I think that was a real triumph for the civil service. They moved at pace, they got the priority, they made it happen. And I think to Alex's point, it was about content rather than process. Building skills for the future, yes, as Kath said, I mean, it was just the mistakes and the infamous spreadsheets. I think the one lesson to pick, well, many lessons, but one to highlight at the end here, Jill, was we were operating at such pace. And I do remember that conversation. We're going to make a mistake. We're going to make a mistake because everything was happening so quickly. But of course, it was all under the George Osborne instruction that £6 billion worth of cuts had to be identified before the recess. I couldn't influence that at the macro level, but I just wonder if we had said, you're going to make a mistake more forcibly, we might have bought ourselves just a few more days. So maybe that's the point about speaking truth unto power and being really frank in the advice that you give.
That's a really good point to end on. My one piece of advice was, for God's sake, don't let incoming ministers sign up to doing a fly on the wall documentary about the change of power. But that's a very personal issue. Anyway, I'm going to close it there. We've got millions of questions coming in. We will think internally about how we address all of those, because there's been so much interest in that. But thank you all for listening for the full hour. And thanks very much to my brilliant panelists, Alex Thomas, Kath Haddon, and of course, Sir David Bell.